On a frigid winter afternoon in 1988, as biting winds from the northern pine forest swept into the town of Westwood, Connecticut, the mysterious disappearance of young businessman Arthur Finch opened one of the longest-running cold cases in local history. Westwood was a quiet town far from the big cities, known for its snow-covered streets in winter, its old-fashioned early 20th century office buildings, and the slow-paced life of its residents. None of them could have imagined that a strange event at the end of that winter would become a topic of conversation for decades to come. Arthur Finch was born and raised in southern Connecticut suburbs. Approaching 30, he was regarded as highly ambitious and possessed outstanding financial management skills. He was the co-founder of an early e-commerce trading company that specialized in consumer goods distribution. Though the field was still very new in the late 20th century, Arthur saw extraordinary growth potential. As a result, his company expanded steadily, bringing him considerable status and wealth. On that fateful winter evening, Arthur left the office after a long workday. The last colleagues who saw him said he appeared to be in a hurry, as if he had another important appointment. Carrying his familiar leather briefcase and wearing his gray wool overcoat, he walked out into the thick fog toward the parking lot. Only a few cars remained scattered there. The dim streetlights cast a gloomy, chilling glow over the old snow. Arthur's black sedan was later found abandoned at the edge of the woods on the west side of town, about a 15-minute drive from his office. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No messages, no evidence of a suspect. The key was still in the ignition, and the driver's seat was adjusted to Arthur's usual position. A thin layer of snow on the roof made it hard for police to determine exactly when the car had been left, but based on engine temperature, they believed it had only recently been parked when discovered. The scene left many people baffled. A man with a successful career, a family, and social standing had suddenly vanished without a trace. The fact that his car was abandoned in the woods sparked numerous theories. Some residents thought he had suffered an accident and become lost in the forest. Others speculated he might have been ambushed or followed. However, the most attention-grabbing explanation centered on his marriage. Arthur was married to Lydia Finch, a beautiful woman from a good family who was several years older than he. Their marriage was described as peaceful in the early years, but gradually grew cold as Arthur's work consumed more and more of his time. Lydia was reserved, private, and rarely appeared in public. She was said to be struggling to adjust to the fast-paced life Arthur pursued. Everyone who knew the couple acknowledged they were still seen together at events occasionally, but the atmosphere between husband and wife was almost icy whenever they appeared in public. The reason police began to suspect Lydia was a large life insurance policy Arthur had taken out not long before his disappearance. $400,000 in 1988 was an enormous sum, enough to raise eyebrows at any investigative agency. Lydia Finch was the sole beneficiary. This sent local public opinion and media into a frenzy, suggesting financial motive might be connected to the disappearance. In the first weeks of the search, police worked alongside volunteers, search dogs, and even helicopters to comb the western forest area. They looked for tracks, clothing, a watch, anything that belonged to Arthur. Every effort failed. No body, no DNA, no clear signs of crime. There were not even footprints in the snow, because fresh snowfall had erased all traces overnight. The silence of the forest baffled investigators. It was as if Arthur Finch had never set foot there. Meanwhile, Lydia displayed an unusual calm. Police described her as cooperative and thorough in answering questions, but emotionally detached. When the media asked about her husband, she remained composed, almost cold. This fueled even greater public outcry. Some believed she was hiding something. Others thought she had simply grown exhausted by the excessive outside attention and withdrawn as a result. Harold Madsen, Westwood's chief detective at the time, held multiple press conferences. He said the case had many irregularities, especially how perfectly smooth the disappearance had been executed, leaving no trace whatsoever. He acknowledged Arthur was an adult who could voluntarily leave his life behind, but that theory was quickly dismissed. There were no withdrawals from his accounts or any prior preparation. His bank accounts remained untouched. His home and assets showed no signs of transfer. His weekly schedule had been completely normal. Nothing indicated any intention to flee. Additionally, no one knew Arthur was facing personal financial difficulties. His company was doing well and showed no signs of crisis. Partners confirmed he had been fully alert and showed no anxiety before important meetings. His disappearance was like a sudden fracture with no warning signs. Time passed, and the case gradually stalled. Spring, summer, and fall of the following year went by without any new leads. Newspaper articles about Arthur Finch became scarce. Initial rumors died down. The people of Westwood returned to their peaceful routine, but the story of the missing businessman lingered as an unsolved mystery. 3 years after the disappearance, police officially classified the case as cold. That meant all active investigation would be suspended, resuming only if new evidence emerged. The file was archived in the records room, formally closed, yet no one knew it would remain dormant there for more than 3 decades. In the years that followed, conspiracy theories spread widely. Some believed Arthur Finch was not dead, but living under a different identity in a distant country. Others thought he had become involved in illegal activities or had been forced to leave his life behind. Some theories were even more outlandish, claiming he had been abducted by a secret organization or encountered something supernatural in the woods. Of course, none of these had any supporting evidence. Meanwhile, Lydia Finch continued to live quietly in the couple's large house. She rarely went out, lived alone, and avoided all publicity. She never remarried or had any public romantic relationship public. The insurance money that many assumed she had coveted was never spent lavishly. This caused many people to question whether the earlier accusations against her had been too hasty. In the early 2000s, when investigative technology had advanced significantly, some newer Westwood detectives proposed reopening the case. They applied modern tracing techniques, DNA analysis, re-examination of old bank transaction records, and three-dimensional crime scene reconstruction. Still, the results remained the same. No new evidence, no body, no suspect. The only noteworthy discovery was an old statement from a resident living near the Western Forest in 1988. That person reported hearing an engine rev louder than normal that evening, as if the car accelerated then abruptly stopped. Then came several minutes of silence, followed by light footsteps, after which everything fell quiet again. The statement had originally been dismissed as too vague, but when reviewed again, it prompted detectives to consider the possibility that a second person had been with Arthur. Despite all efforts, the case made no progress. Over time, newer generations in Westwood knew Arthur Finch only through retold stories. To them, it was just an old town mystery. However, for those who lived through the 80s, especially those who had known Arthur, the disappearance remained an unfillable void. It represented the underlying fear that anyone could suddenly be torn from their life. 40 years have now passed since Arthur Finch vanished. The case file sits in storage, thick dust covering the yellowed pages. Yet for investigators, the case has never truly been closed. No body was found. The motive is unclear. There is insufficient evidence to charge any suspect, and the victim seems to have dissolved into thin air. That is why, even today, The Arthur Finch case remains one of Connecticut's most mysterious cold cases. Looking back at the entire story, Arthur Finch's disappearance is not merely a legal matter, but a deeply human tragedy. It is the story of an ambitious young man, of a wife suspected rather than understood, of a small town shrouded in mystery, and of a family that never had the chance to receive final answers. The decades-long silence has only made the case colder, leaving readers with a feeling of emptiness, haunting unease, and despair. Today, as forensic technology continues to advance, some people still hope the truth will one day be uncovered, perhaps a bone discovered in the woods, an unexpected piece of evidence surfacing, or a belated confession from someone still alive. But until that happens, Arthur Finch will forever remain the ghost of the winter of 1988. The day he walked out of his office into the cold night and never returned. That winter night in 1988, just as a blizzard began lashing the eastern side of Westwood, the phone at the town police station rang repeatedly. It was a call from Lydia Finch, the woman who only hours earlier had been sitting in their large house in Fairfield, waiting for her husband to return from the office. As the hours passed in silence with no call or message from Arthur Finch, worrying turned to panic. Lydia immediately phoned the police and reported that her husband had disappeared on the drive from Westwood to Fairfield, a route he had driven hundreds of times over the years. Sergeant Samuel Rourke, considered one of the town's most experienced officers, took the call. He knew that in weather like this, every minute counted. The wind howled in gusts. Snow fell so heavily that visibility was sometimes only a few meters. Driving alone on a stormy night always carried the risk of accident, skidding, or worse, becoming lost. Yet Lydia's voice carried an unusual tension, as if something more serious than an accident was unfolding. Immediately after the call, Samuel Rourke activated emergency search procedures. He mobilized the nearest patrol units and ordered a sweep of the entire route connecting Westwood and Fairfield. That road ran long through sparse forests and skirted Blackwood Lake, a large body of water often shrouded in fog and cold winds whenever the weather turned. On that blizzard night, the area was almost completely dark. The pale yellow light from street lamps was scattered by the heavy snow, making the surroundings hazy and nearly impossible to navigate. Samuel Rourke drove the lead patrol car. He switched the headlights to their brightest setting, but could still only see a short distance ahead. Other rescue units spread out across the area, each understanding that if Arthur had crashed and was outside his vehicle in this weather, his chances of survival were slim. The freezing wind could cause severe hypothermia in just tens of minutes. Meanwhile, the station received information from Arthur Finch's office. An employee confirmed Arthur had left work late that afternoon. Security cameras at the exit captured him walking toward the parking lot, but the blizzard that arrived shortly afterward had obscured all outdoor activity. This matched Lydia's report that Arthur should have been home hours earlier. Samuel Rourke ordered a segment-by-segment search of the road, paying special attention to sharp curves and places where a car could easily slide into a snow-filled ditch or down an embankment. But after the patrols covered the entire main route, everything remained quiet. No accidents, no debris, no indication Arthur's car had ever left the road. Fresh snow had buried the roadway so quickly that any traces were erased within minutes. As midnight approached, one patrol unit reported finding a suspicious vehicle parked on the shoulder near the turnoff to Blackwood Forest. Samuel immediately raced to the scene. The bright lights of the patrol cars illuminated a snow-covered car, but the license plate clearly identified it as Arthur Finch's black sedan. The car had been abandoned in an odd location. It was not a safe pull-off area or a parking spot. It was a narrow, rarely traveled stretch of road, a few hundred meters from Blackwood Lake. The doors were locked, with no signs of forced entry. When police opened the car, they found the interior perfectly tidy. Arthur's leather briefcase was no longer on the passenger seat. His mobile phone, a still rather primitive device in the late 80s, was missing from the car and not found in the surrounding area. Most importantly, there were no footprints outside the vehicle, not even faint ones. The snow had fallen too heavily and too fast, erasing everything that happened earlier. If Arthur had left the car and walked into the woods, his tracks would have been buried within minutes. There were no drag marks or signs of a struggle. The car appeared to have been abandoned calmly and silently, revealing nothing about the driver's fate. The search immediately expanded into Blackwood Forest. That forest was considered the most treacherous in the suburbs, with steep slopes, small ravines, and ice-covered boulders. Even in normal conditions, moving through it was difficult. During a blizzard, it was nearly impossible. The rescue team used high-powered flashlights and safety ropes to avoid sliding down dangerous inclines. Samuel Rourke led the group deeper into the woods. The icy wind cut like knives against their faces. Snow constantly blurred the flashlight beams, making the light unstable and dim. Yet no matter how carefully they checked every tree trunk, crevice, and bush, they found no trace of Arthur Finch. No discarded coat, no scrap of fabric, no papers. Nothing proved he had ever entered that forest. Around 3 in the morning, the search was temporarily halted because the weather had become too dangerous. Snow fell heavier, winds grew stronger, and temperatures dropped to levels that endangered the rescuers themselves. Samuel stood staring into the hazy darkness of Blackwood Forest, feeling helplessness rise as every direction led to nothing. The weather was not merely an obstacle, it seemed to be concealing a secret, rendering every search tool useless. The next morning, before full daylight, the search resumed. This time they brought tracking dogs to the scene, hoping to compensate for what humans could not accomplish during the blizzard. But the heavy snow overwhelmed the dogs' ability to hold a scent. Within minutes, they lost the trail completely and could not determine Arthur's direction of travel. Meanwhile, the route between Westwood and Fairfield was swept multiple times. Police checked Blackwood Lake, the eastern slopes, and the small bridges over frozen streams. They even used small boats to examine the lake edges that had not yet frozen solid, but every effort proved fruitless. There was no evidence of accident, attack, or voluntary departure. What troubled Samuel the most was the way the car had been left. If Arthur had crashed or skidded, the vehicle would show damage or be positioned off the road. If he had decided to walk into the woods, he would never choose such a dangerous, remote spot in that brutal weather. If someone had followed or attacked him, some trace would remain. Yet the scene was unnaturally clean to an abnormal degree. When reporting the search results back to the station, Samuel noted clearly that the disappearance was too sudden and too absolute to be explained by ordinary scenarios. With years of experience, he believed human intervention was involved. An accident or voluntary departure rarely left a scene so perfectly clean of any trace. But he also understood that without evidence, every hypothesis remained mere speculation. Lydia Finch was informed that her husband's car had been found. When she arrived at the scene, Samuel observed how she stood silently staring at the vehicle, how she lightly placed her hand on the ice-cold door. She did not cry or scream, but her heavy silence made the atmosphere even gloomier. Though she said nothing, everyone could sense the panic she was trying to conceal behind her calm expression. The entire area around Blackwood Lake was turned into a temporary rescue hub for 3 full days. Tents were erected, maps were spread out, and rescue teams took shifts searching from dawn until dusk. They expanded the search radius for miles, checking every corner, every patch of forest, every lakeshore, every narrow trail leading to rocky outcrops. Yet nothing changed. Arthur Finch had completely vanished from the world, as if he had never been on that road during the blizzard night. 3 days later, the storm cleared and the winter sun cast faint patches of light across the sky. But that clarity brought no new clues. When the rescue teams completed their final sweep, everyone had to accept that the search had failed. In the debriefing, Samuel Rourke recorded in the file that the disappearance occurred under the worst possible weather conditions, causing all natural traces to be erased before authorities could reach the scene. He also noted that the scene provided no clear evidence to support any single theory: no accident, no skid, no signs of violence, but also no indication of voluntary departure. That failed search became the crucial opening chapter in the Arthur Finch cold case file. It marked the moment when both police and the victim's family entered a maze with no exit. Whatever happened that blizzard night was witnessed only by the overcast sky, the freezing wind, and Blackwood Lake, and none of them ever revealed anything. The first days of 1989 passed under a gloomy, oppressive atmosphere that enveloped the entire town of Westwood. The blizzard had ended, but the winter chill still clung to every rooftop, every street, every stretch of eastern forest. After days of fruitless searching, police were forced to shift focus from rescue to investigation of whatever evidence remained. The only substantial piece of evidence at that point was Arthur Finch's abandoned car. It sat motionless on the roadside, draped in a white blanket of snow like a cold burial shroud, waiting to be deciphered for what it had witnessed the night its owner disappeared. On the morning of the new year, the Connecticut State Forensic Team was dispatched to Westwood to examine the vehicle in greater detail. Their task was not only to check for mechanical failure or elect traces, but also to reconstruct the entire sequence of events: how the car came to stop, when the engine was turned off, and what happened inside the cabin before it was abandoned. This was the stage where even the smallest detail could shift the direction of the entire case. Once the snow was cleared, the car's body became fully visible. There were no major dents, no scrape marks, no unusual mud on the tires. This indicated the vehicle had not been in an accident and had not slid off the road and then been driven back on, as some initial theories suggested. The tires were in normal condition with no significant pressure differences. Moreover, the amount of snow cover showed the car had been parked there at least since the night of the blizzard, perfectly consistent with the time Arthur Finch was reported missing. Yet these initial observations offered no substantial answers. Only when the doors were opened did investigators begin to uncover contradictions. The first thing that caught their attention was the state of the engine. After thorough examination, the forensic team confirmed the engine had been deliberately turned off, not killed by mechanical failure or impact. Based on residual heat and mechanical indicators, they concluded the engine was shut down under completely normal conditions. There were no signs of overheating, no oil shortage, no ice in the system. Everything pointed to someone intentionally switching off the ignition, closing the doors, and walking away as a deliberate act, not in panic or due to an accident. The second detail that particularly alarmed investigators was the position of the driver's seat. Arthur Finch was a man approximately 6 feet tall, slim, but taller than average. Normally, he kept his seat pushed far back to accommodate his long legs. However, when the car was found, the driver's seat was in a completely different position, pushed far forward, significantly closer to the steering wheel. For anyone familiar with driving, this was unmistakable. A man of Arthur's height would find it extremely uncomfortable, almost impossible, to drive with a seat that close. His knees would be jammed against the dashboard, something he had never done. This discovery immediately sent the investigation down a new path. It was no longer simply a disappearance caused by accident or Arthur voluntarily leaving. The misadjusted driver's seat became clear evidence that someone else had sat in the driver's seat or had otherwise tampered with the vehicle after Arthur left it. The bigger question was who that person was and what they had done with Arthur. Fingerprint samples collected inside the cabin were mostly Arthur Finch's, understandable since he was the regular driver. However, a few faint prints were unidentifiable because snow and moisture had degraded them. They were not clear enough to match anyone in the state database. This disappointed the team, but Samuel Rourke believed the seat position alone was a significant lead. One undeniable fact was that Arthur had never driven with a seat like that. The forensic investigators continued examining every detail inside the car. They found that the cabin temperature at the time suggested no one had remained inside for long after stopping. This meant the engine was turned off almost immediately after the car stopped. No one lingered to stay warm or rest. Such an abrupt abandonment of the vehicle could only happen in two scenarios. Either the driver left willingly for a very short time, or some external pressure or coercion forced the driver to exit immediately. Given that Arthur had vanished without a trace, the first possibility was nearly ruled out. Another discovery concerned the headlight system. When checked, the forensic team found the headlights, which had been completely turned off before the engine was shut down. Most drivers, especially in blizzard conditions with limited visibility, leave headlights on until they exit the vehicle, and many even forget to turn them off after parking. But Arthur's car was different. The lights were deliberately and neatly switched off. This further reinforced the conclusion that leaving the vehicle had not been done in panic. The dashboard and gear shift were also received close scrutiny. The car was properly in park, with the parking brake engaged. There were no signs of skidding or loss of control before stopping. This proved the stop was planned, not a passive situation caused by mechanical failure or slippery roads forcing Arthur to pull over. One more detail made the case even more puzzling. The outside temperature that night had dropped into double-digit negative figures. If Arthur had voluntarily left the car, he could not have gone far in such extreme cold, especially without extra clothing or gear. There was no indication he had taken a spare coat or any luggage. This led investigators to ask why Arthur would abandon the car and walk away when every condition was against him. The only reasonable answer was that he had not left voluntarily. After completing the interior analysis, the team moved to the surrounding area. Thick snow made finding footprints hopeless, but they still measured, photographed, and marked any potentially suspicious spots. Notably, the parking location itself made no sense. It was a narrow stretch of road with no logical reason for Arthur to stop there unless forced by an external factor, perhaps another vehicle blocking the way or someone on the road signaling him to stop. This supported the theory that the car may have been driven by someone else after Arthur was removed from it. More importantly, the forward seat position was the clearest evidence that the final driver's height did not match Arthur's. State records listed Arthur as notably tall. If someone much shorter had taken the wheel, they would naturally pull the seat forward for comfortable driving. That is ordinary driver behavior. But if true, who was that person? And why did they drive the car to this remote spot and then abandon it? Another question arose. If that person was the perpetrator, why didn't they stage the scene to look like an accident? Instead, the car was left in a highly suspicious location. This suggested the perpetrator was not overly worried about police analyzing the vehicle, perhaps believing the blizzard would erase all traces, or knowing there was no evidence inside linking them to the crime. Upon deeper analysis, investigators also found no signs of ransacking. Nothing indicated anyone had searched for documents or valuables. Arthur's briefcase was missing from the car, but its purpose for being taken was unclear. If financial motive was behind the crime, the perpetrator might have taken important papers or assets, yet nothing suggested material interest. This weakened any robbery theory. From Samuel Rourke's perspective, the seat position discovery completely changed the nature of the case. Had the seat remained in Arthur's usual position, a voluntary departure during the blizzard, though illogical, could still be explained by mental distress or psychological breakdown. But with the seat moved, that theory lost all footing. No one intentionally readjusts their own seat before disappearing. That only happens if a second person is involved. In the report sent to superiors, Samuel clearly stated that multiple indicators inside the vehicle pointed to intervention by another individual, and Arthur Finch's disappearance was no longer an ordinary accident or missing person case. It may have been a carefully calculated crime executed during the blizzard to conceal every trace. However, the case's biggest problem remained unchanged. Everything was inference based on contradictions, while conclusive incriminating evidence was non-existent. No body, no witnesses, no signs Arthur resisted or was attacked. There were no cameras on that stretch of road. No residents who saw anything unusual. Even the faint fingerprints were insufficient to identify anyone. The investigation continued for many more weeks, but each passing day only deepened the sense of deadlock. The roads around Blackwood Lake, forest trails, and icy slopes were searched repeatedly. Teams from neighboring counties were brought in, yet no one found anything new. It was as if the final driver had vanished along with Arthur into the white snow. Finally, after weeks of analysis and searching, the official conclusion was that the evidence inside the car was markedly contradictory, indicating another person had driven it. But due to lack of conclusive proof, the case could not advance further. The vehicle was seized as evidence, sealed, and stored in the state evidence warehouse. It became the symbol of an inexplicable disappearance, a silent piece of evidence holding secrets no one could decode. In the years that followed, many new investigators were assigned to review the file, but the car remained the center of all speculation. It was both the most important clue and the most baffling puzzle. Each investigator offered a different theory, yet none provided a final answer. And so, from the early days of 1989, Arthur Finch's abandoned car officially became a crucial yet deeply contradictory piece of the decades-long cold case. It was proof that someone else had intervened, but also proof the case could not be solved easily. It opened new investigative avenues while simultaneously deepening the overall mystery. While Arthur Finch remained missing without a trace, the car became the last witness to that fateful night, yet a witness that would never speak. Between 2013 and 2015, 25 to 27 years after Arthur Finch vanished in the winter of 1988, the case, long thought permanently forgotten, was unexpectedly reopened by the Connecticut State Police Cold Case Unit, a division dedicated to decades-old unsolved files. The reinvestigation was driven not only by the pursuit of truth, but also by the persistent ember of justice within the legal system. Even when years had passed, evidence had degraded, and witnesses' memories had faded. When the Arthur Finch file was pulled back onto the table, it was not merely a professional challenge, but a reminder that every disappearance, every unresolved suspicion, every unfinished ending carries the pain of a family and the lingering regret of those sworn to uphold justice. The central figure in this revival was investigator Clara Vance, a highly experienced female officer specializing in trace evidence analysis and old case file exploitation. Clara was not the first to touch the Finch file, but she was the first to recognize that evidence once deemed meaningless could hold entirely new value in light of modern forensic science. From her earliest days in the field, Clara had believed criminals can outrun time but never the truth. Thus, when handed a thick dossier filled with reports, photographs, and notes written more than 2 decades earlier, she felt a powerful urge to find the final answer to Arthur Finch's fate. In the late 1980s, forensic technology, especially DNA analysis, was extremely limited. Many items collected at the disappearance scene, including evidence from the abandoned car and certain personal belongings, could not be thoroughly processed due to lack of tools. Thanks to Connecticut's strict evidence preservation policy, the small amount of physical evidence, though limited, had been reasonably well preserved in a cold storage facility for unsolved cases. This gave Clara hope that applying the most advanced DNA technology, particularly short tandem repeat STR-DNA analysis, which only matured in the 21st century, might unlock secrets long buried. STR-DNA analysis is a revolutionary advance in forensic science. It allows scientists to examine extremely small DNA segments, even just a few cells, to establish identity or biological relationships. In the context of the Finch case, it offered a precious ray of hope. Clara Vance knew that to restart analysis, she had to re-examine every sealed piece of evidence, including fragments once thought irrelevant. It was during this process that she discovered a detail previous investigators had largely overlooked. A small, old gray handkerchief recovered from the passenger seat of the car and originally labeled as owner unknown. The handkerchief had initially been recorded as possibly belonging to Arthur Finch, but the 1988 file contained no definitive conclusion because testing at the time was superficial and visual only. However, under modern lab lighting, Clara noticed a faint reddish stain in one corner, so faint that earlier investigators had completely missed it. Because the stain was tiny and time had altered its color, no one had dared confirm it was blood. But Clara knew that if it was blood, even a single microscopic drop, modern technology could still extract DNA. The handkerchief was sent to the Advanced Forensic Lab, where specialists began the weeks-long DNA extraction. Because the evidence was over 25 years old, recovering viable genetic material was a major challenge, requiring ultra-precise temperature and humidity control and complex biochemical steps. Yet after many patient attempts, technicians obtained a clean enough DNA sample for STR analysis. The resulting profile was then compared against stored DNA from Arthur Finch's family to determine whether the sample could belong to him. When the final results were printed, both Clara and the forensic team felt the turning point moment of the case. The DNA on the handkerchief did not match Arthur Finch. This meant the person who had held the handkerchief or left the blood stain was not the victim. From an item once dismissed as unimportant, the handkerchief revealed the truth that another individual had been inside the abandoned car all those years ago. This became the key that unlocked an entirely new investigative direction, overturning the previous assumption that Arthur had been alone on his drive from Westwood to Fairfield that blizzard night. Clara immediately ran the recovered DNA sample against the Connecticut State database, hoping to identify the person who left the trace. The state DNA database had been created many years after the disappearance and continuously expanded, containing records of countless individuals arrested or convicted. The comparison took time due to the volume of data, but eventually, the system returned a partial match strong enough to prove the DNA donor was related to a criminal record from the late 1990s. Although it was only a partial match, it carried significant legal weight. Clara and the cold case team promptly verified the identity linked to the old file. It belonged to a man who had been involved in various illegal activities around the Blackwood Lake area, the very place police had searched for Arthur Finch that blizzard night without success. The man had been arrested for disorderly conduct and violence in the late 90s. then left the state and had not resurfaced in recent cases. From this DNA lead, Clara was able to sketch a much broader picture of what might have happened the night Arthur Finch vanished. The presence of a stranger's DNA in the car proved Arthur had not been alone before disappearing. It was even possible he had met or been approached by this individual before the car was abandoned. This shook the long-standing theory that Lydia Finch had orchestrated the disappearance. Although Lydia remained the sole beneficiary of the $400,000 life insurance policy and had long been suspected, the appearance of another person inside the vehicle forced investigators to reassess motive, perpetrator, and the actual sequence of events with greater caution. To shed more light, Clara ordered a complete re-examination of the 1988 vehicle forensic reports. Faint notes about stain locations, unidentified fingerprints, and the unusual driver's seat adjustment suddenly became far more valuable than ever. If the seat did not fit Arthur Finch's height, it further supported the theory that someone else had driven the car or at least tampered with it. Combined with the DNA on the handkerchief, this created strong circumstantial evidence that Arthur may have been coerced, attacked, or at the very least, had been sharing the vehicle with that person in his final hours. Modern technology also allowed the forensic team to rescue old crime scene photographs with reconstruction software, revealing tiny traces previously overlooked. They discovered soil residue on the car's floor mats originating from the Blackwood Lake shoreline, an area with distinctive color and rare mineral composition not typically found on regular roads. This lent further support to the idea that either the car or Arthur himself had been near Blackwood Lake before the vehicle was abandoned. On the Fairfield route, all these discoveries carried not only scientific significance, but also reignited the fighting spirit of every member of the cold case unit. They knew that even the smallest clue from decades-old evidence could become a vital piece in reconstructing Arthur Finch's final journey. STRDNA technology had turned what seemed an unsolvable case into one with a clear path forward, rekindling hope of uncovering the truth. After nearly 3 decades, Clara Vance and her colleagues' efforts demonstrated both the power of modern forensic science and the results that perseverance can yield. No matter how much time has passed, missing victims, families without answers, and dusty files all deserve justice. Thus, the 2013 to 2015 reinvestigation was not merely an attempt to rebuild a case. It was a journey that revealed the strength of justice when combined with intellect, technology, and determination. Thanks to that perseverance, the Arthur Finch case finally achieved its most significant breakthrough since the icy winter night of 1988, when he vanished. From an old handkerchief and a faint bloodstain, the truth gradually emerged, causing pieces from the past to fall into place. STRDNA technology became the key that not only reopened the case, but also lit the hope that no matter how long it takes, justice always has a path back. Between 2015 and 2016, as the final phase of the investigation reached its conclusion, the 27-year-old missing person case of businessman Arthur Finch was officially closed, an event that marked one of the most important milestones in Connecticut's cold case history. The outcome of this re-examination not only provided answers about the fate of a man who disappeared on a winter night in 1988, but also carried profound meaning for the community, forensic science, and everyone who believes in the enduring power of justice. When the file was sealed and the official conclusion announced, the entire story became living proof that the combination of human intellect, law enforcement perseverance, and scientific progress can open doors that time seemed to have locked forever. For more than 2 decades after Arthur Finch vanished, no one could have imagined that this seemingly hopeless case would return to the public spotlight. When the cold case unit reopened the file in the early 2010s, investigator Clara Vance and her team resolved to bring the case to its ultimate truth, regardless of how time had eroded memories, degraded evidence, and scattered witnesses. By applying advanced STRDNA technology, they uncovered forgotten evidence, most notably the DNA sample from the old handkerchief that still bore a faint blood stain. From that discovery, they traced a connection to a mysterious individual who had been inside Arthur Finch's car before it was abandoned. Although the DNA did not belong to Arthur, but to a man with a criminal record from the late 20th century. This clue proved pivotal, creating the turning point in analyzing motive and identifying the true perpetrator. After months of re-examining old documents and conducting additional forensic analysis, the team finally found the intersection between the new evidence and long-standing suspicions in the original file. While the DNA did not directly prove the man was the killer, his unexplained presence inside the vehicle prompted deeper scrutiny of Arthur Finch's relationships, particularly his marriage to Lydia Finch. Since 1988, Lydia had been a person of interest because of the $400,000 insurance policy she alone stood to collect. But without a body and no concrete evidence, those suspicions had been shelved. However, when modern forensics re-illuminated overlooked details, a series of inconsistencies in Lydia's statements became strikingly clear. Circumstantial evidence from the handkerchief, foreign traces inside the car, soil analysis from the Blackwood Lake area, and logical timelines all indicated that Arthur Finch was not the victim of a random disappearance, but was likely murdered as part of a premeditated plan. As the puzzle pieces came together, investigator Clara Vance realized it was time to re-interview Lydia Finch and re-evaluate her original statements. In the early days of the case, Lydia had always insisted their marriage was perfectly normal and that Arthur left the office in an untroubled mood. Yet newly obtained financial records revealed the Finch family was in far more serious financial trouble than Lydia had ever admitted. Mounting debts, failed investments, and suspicious transactions had caused ongoing tension between the couple in the months before Arthur vanished. As the financial situation worsened, Arthur's $400,000 life insurance policy stood out prominently in the file, leading investigators to believe Lydia may have seen an opportunity to solve her problems by eliminating her husband. The forensic evidence gathered during the reinvestigation, combined with financial records and inconsistencies in Lydia's statements, formed a case strong enough to obtain an arrest warrant. Lydia Finch was taken into custody in late 2015. The arrest quickly drew intense media attention, as it was the first time in nearly 3 decades that an official suspect had been named in one that had been considered a hopeless case. For Connecticut residents, the event was both shocking and a revival of memories of one of the most mysterious disappearances of the late 20th century. Once in custody, Lydia Finch faced charges related to her husband's murder and staging the scene. The prosecution presented a chain of reasoning built on STRDNA advancements, bloodstain analysis, physical traces from the vehicle, and detailed soil reports from the Blackwood Lake area. Additionally, several witnesses who had contact with Lydia around the time of the disappearance were re-interviewed, and their new statements further strengthened the prosecution's case. One of the most damning details was evidence that Lydia had attempted to modify the insurance policy shortly before Arthur vanished. Action revealing clear calculation and financial motive. In early 2016, during the final hearing, the Connecticut court officially ruled there was sufficient basis to conclude Lydia Finch was directly responsible for Arthur Finch's death. Although Arthur's body was never recovered, the justice system accepted the chain of circumstantial evidence, DNA results, and modern forensic reports This was rare for decades-old cases, where the absence of a body makes conviction nearly impossible. Yet in this instance, STRDNA technology and investigative persistence filled the gaps that had once stalled the case. When the final verdict was announced, the Arthur Finch case file was officially sealed. A press conference by the Connecticut State Police followed shortly afterward to inform the public of the outcome. During the conference, police representatives emphasized that this was not only a victory for forensic science, but also proof of the never-give-up spirit of the investigators who spent months poring over old notes, opening dusty evidence boxes, and relentlessly pursuing every tiny lead. The Arthur Finch case was likened to a complete record of how modern investigation can write a new ending to stories long thought closed. The case had a profound impact on the forensic and law enforcement communities across the United States. Many legal experts hailed it as a textbook example that truth never truly disappears, it only waits for the right moment to be illuminated. As science advances, cases once deemed hopeless can be reopened with fresh hope. STRDNA is not merely an analytical tool, but an extension of justice that brings buried secrets back into the light. Police academies nationwide added the case to their curricula as a prime example of combining science with traditional investigative methods. On a broader societal level, the resolution of the Arthur Finch case carried a powerful message about justice. No crime can remain hidden forever, and no matter how many years pass, the truth will find a way to surface. Arthur's family finally received an answer, painful though it was, ending nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. The community where Arthur lived also felt relief as questions that had lingered for years were answered. One of the greatest meanings of the case was its affirmation that justice depends not on speed but on persistence. For nearly 30 years, the Arthur Finch case had been an open wound in Connecticut's investigative history. Yet when human effort and scientific progress aligned at the right moment, the search for truth was completed. From an old handkerchief to STRDNA technology, from forgotten data to modern analysis, every detail contributed to reconstructing a story that had been buried under the ice and snow of time for 27 years. When the file was finally placed in permanent storage, the Arthur Finch case was no longer just a solved crime. It became a symbol of resilience and faith that justice may be delayed but never denied, faith that science can open the doors to truth, and faith that every secret, no matter how deeply buried, will one day be found beneath the light of justice.